And one. All right, welcome to the 14th workshop in the Freudian Unconscious. This is a workshop series, which is an ongoing exploration of Freud's original texts, starting with his papers in the 19th century. And now we're working our way up to a paper that was written in 1909 titled The Five Lectures in Psychoanalysis. It's a paper which is broken up into 5 sections. We're going to be covering the first 2 sections in this workshop. And the interesting thing about this paper is that it is the introduction of psychoanalysis in a North American context. There is a lot of mythology and story about these lectures being held at Clark University. There is still a rich and strong psychoanalytic tradition stemming and active at Clark University. In fact, one of the biggest psychoanalytic conferences, specifically the LAC conferences, are being held currently at Clark University. So there's a rich tradition at Clark University that originates here with these papers and this conference, and so in that sense, we're engaging with knowledge, and we're engaging with an event which still has a big echo today. In fact, one of the biggest, I guess, stories about this lecture is that Freud and Jung, who traveled to America together to give these lectures, the story goes that Freud told Jung that they don't know that we're bringing the plague, psychoanalysis here, as the sort of study of symptoms and neuroses and spiritual sickness. So there's a way in which they sort of knew they were causing some trouble here by introducing these ideas in the North American context. So I'm just going to share my screen, and we're going to cover this, the first 2 parts of this paper. All right, so there you see the picture. This is a picture from the conference where you see Freud on the left and Jung on the right. This is at a time before their split, of course, and specifically the split around things like the sexuality of the libido and the place of sexuality in psychoanalysis. Also relationship of psychoanalysis to religion and mysticism. This is well before their split, which will occur in the next decade. So Freud starts off by introducing psychoanalysis to the New World. Again, they're at Clark University. He gives credit to Joseph Breuer and the Studies on Hysteria, which is basically the first technical book written on psychoanalysis, Studies on Hysteria. And he gives credit to Joseph Breuer for coming up with the idea and basically having the willingness to approach a patient, a 21-year-old girl, with an extremely enigmatic condition, which was characterized by violent emotional shocks. These violent emotional shocks had physiological effects, but when it comes to the medical establishment of the time, and to be honest, the medical establishment of our day, the ways in which we approach people with extreme emotional problems is quite dismissive, and that dismissiveness comes in part due to the fact that nobody knows what to do, and it's a mysterious situation. Nonetheless, Joseph Breuer approached what this individual was going through in a way that medical doctors weren't willing to, meaning that medical doctors, when it comes to emotional situations, typically, quote unquote, lose sympathy and don't know what to do with, quote unquote, spiritual or emotional illness. And I think that that's a really interesting way to think about psychoanalysis, is that psychoanalysis is not so much a spiritual or emotional identity. We talked today about spiritual identities, mystical identities. It's rather that psychoanalysis situates itself in the problems of spiritual and emotional identification. And specifically in the first case of psychoanalysis dealing with hysterical patients, these spiritual or emotional illnesses have the nature of quote unquote states of absence. And I think that the emphasis on states of absence can't be overstated. I think that in the contemporary scientific and philosophical literature, and in the Lacanian tradition, it's coming to terms with and coming to an understanding of absences, the way absence functions in our psyche. To give it context on the contemporary Clark University series lectures and conferences, they title them the lack conferences. So here lack can be seen as in some sense synonymous with what Freud's talking about in regards to states of absence. Here with hysterical patients, the states of absence are characterized by an altered personality and extreme confusion, which basically here means a breakdown of the normative egoic identity. The places in the individual subject where the normal egoic identity does not function, becomes incoherent, becomes unbearable, and that's why it becomes a spiritual emotional illness. So what Joseph Breuer did was basically attempt to treat the hysterical patient under hypnotic free association. So psychoanalysis has a very close origin with hypnosis as a method. We're going to see how that transforms in the second lecture, but it's important to note that hypnosis and psychoanalysis here are closely related in terms of methodology. And the idea Joseph Breuer had was that under a hypnotic free association, these absent states, these states of altered personality and extreme confusion, can be revealed on the level of their cause. So in other words, under hypnotic free association, you can get to the underlying psychological cause. And in the case of this first patient, which was again explored in the studies on hysteria, the underlying cause was a melancholic fantasy. So specifically, you'll perhaps recall in the text that we were reading for this, that the underlying melancholic fantasy for this patient was the loss of her father and being at the bedside of her sick and dying father. So psychoanalysis here becomes known as the quote unquote talking cure, or also interesting in context of contemporary philosophy, chimney sweeping. Chimney sweeping here is an interesting metaphor to connect with talking cure, because basically what they're describing here is a dirty mind, a mind that is blocked up, a mind that is clogged up with painful memories. Freud here literally says that emotional experiences can cause psychological traumas manifesting in symptoms where, quote unquote, the individual is suffering from reminiscences, meaning suffering from unconscious memories, suffering from painful events in the past, which they are perhaps no longer capable to recall consciously, and perhaps were unable to integrate and synthesize into their normal egoic identity for whatever reason. So the idea here is that the combination of hypnosis and free association, meaning simply the free speech of the individual talking about emotional disturbances from the past, is the way to which one can approach a cure of and a release from their own pathological memories. Now, the idea here is that you have to start, and this is in part, a prelude to why Freud becomes a little bit skeptical of hypnosis, is because the free association, in order to be complete, in order to be total, has to start with the latest, the most recent problems that the subject is dealing with, and work its way backwards. And in working its way backwards, towards the earliest memories, of course, of childhood and infancy. The pathogenesis, the pathogenic nature of the symptom becomes more intense. And I guess that's, again, a little bit of a clue as to why Freud was skeptical of hypnosis, because, and we'll go into this in greater technical detail, but basically, you bypass all of the ways in which the ego is repressing its truth through the hypnotic suggestion. So the symptom of the hysteric or the neurotic here is basically conceptualized as an unconscious, but nonetheless an emotional clinging to memories of the past. And what this emotional clinging produces is an inability for the subject to be fully immediate, to be fully present, and to be engaged with the real. You know, and here using, for example, Lacanian terminology of the real is what isn't working. The real is itself traumatic. The real is itself disturbing. So basically, the hysteric and the neurotic are struggling to be present to the real of whatever the immediate situation is for consciousness, due to unconscious emotional attachments. And here, I like this word Freud uses. He connects this to, quote unquote, a strangulated affect. And that the strangulated affect here gets put to abnormal use, which is why you have the hysterical or neurotic symptom. And this symptom becomes an increasing burden upon the patient's mental life. And as a principle of psychoanalysis, the psychoanalytic treatment only begins when a patient submits to analysis, meaning that psychoanalysis does not go around identifying symptoms in other people who aren't themselves submitting to analysis. The patient has to themselves come to analysis, and basically they are coming to analysis because the burden of their symptom is making their life unbearable. The burden of their symptom is making their life unlivable. So the symptom reaches its highest pitch of intensity when it is approached on the closest level. And that's because basically the ego is trying to protect itself. The symptom is trying to protect itself. The symptom wants to continue existing. So it increases its pitch of intensity as a defense, as a way of maintaining itself, as a way of continuing its pathological identity. And the interesting thing is, once it is, quote unquote, here connected back to the metaphor of chimney sweeping, once the symptom is fully ventilated, it vanishes. It disappears into nothingness because it was just an image. It was an image of the past. It was an image that the individual was clinging to. And so once it's been processed, it just disappears. So here, the final part of the first lecture is basically introducing the idea that psychoanalysis is attempting, and he explicitly says that the entire theory is incomplete and by necessity incomplete, and that if someone were to produce a complete theory, we should not trust a complete theory because it's just too complex and too open-ended of a situation when we're dealing with emotional illnesses and spiritual sickness. But that psychoanalysis is nonetheless attempting to approach a psychological theory of the neuroses with affective processes as the cause. So basically what that means is that psychoanalysis is an attempt to theorize the way in which our mental life is difficult because of emotional disturbances. And that the symptom here that appears in the location of the disturbance and I love this terminology because it reminds me so much of contemporary Zizkian philosophy, is that the symptom is quote unquote a foreign body or an alien, which is equal to and coextensive with the gap or the amnesia of the memory where the trauma is located. So you can see here a very nice model of the unconscious, which Freud is going to go into in greater detail in the second lecture. And again, he concludes in this first lecture by reminding us that in hypnosis, what you're basically doing is bringing this gap to consciousness, bringing this amnesia of memory to consciousness, and you can see the symptom. You can see the symptom that the hysteric and the neurotic is dealing with. But the problem, again, and we're going to get into this in the second lecture, the problem with hypnosis is that you bypass all of the mechanisms of repression which are necessary to work through in a free association. So it's in some sense a trick. It's in some sense it's speeding up a process which needs more time, according to Freud. So that's the end of the first one. We're going to do the second one now. Might as well just go into it and get through with it, and then we'll have a discussion about both. So he introduces in the second lecture the idea that the central point of psychoanalytic theory is basically what we just covered, how he's describing it here as a splitting of the mind and a disassociation of the personality between the conscious and the unconscious. And the reason why this splitting of the mind occurs and this disassociation of the personality occurs is because a quote unquote innate weakness, here you can recall Lacan's mirror stage and the impotence of the specular image. There's an innate weakness for the subject to hold the multiplicity of processes which are going on inside and to create a unity out of those processes. So a splitting occurs where the processes which are unable to be integrated into the conscious ego are repressed, negated, hidden, buried, and ultimately return in a repressed form. That's the return of the repressed. So again, recalling that Joseph Breuer suggests hypnotic suggestion as necessary to attain knowledge of the pathogenic connection of the symptom. In other words, when an individual is in hypnotic suggestion, all of the unconscious emerges to the surface, and you can sort of see the symptom itself in its original sort of unrepressed form. Now, here's where Freud starts to differ from Breuer, and here's where Freud developed psychoanalysis proper as we came to know of psychoanalysis in the 20th century. He says, quote unquote, I soon came to dislike hypnosis as a quote unquote mystical ally. So you can see here even the germs of where Freud and Carl Jung will differ, because Carl Jung is not agreeing with Freud on this point. For Carl Jung, hypnosis and a mystical ally is a positive thing, whereas for Freud, hypnosis and a mystical ally is a negative thing, an obfuscation of the mechanisms of repression which are ongoing in the subject's identity. So Freud starts with a normal state of the psyche. He doesn't want to disturb the psyche with hypnosis or any other, to put it into basically an altered state. Now, this makes his job much more difficult at the same time, because the symptom is being covered over and it's in essence forgotten on both the side of the patient, and of course the therapist has no idea what the symptom is either. So both the patient and the analyst are in the unknown. They're in the dark. Nobody knows really what's going on. However, Freud discovers that through free association alone, and again, covering from previous lectures, this free association can go on for years, that in the free association, you start to unravel the unconscious force of repression, which is maintaining a pathogenic condition in the patient's resistances. And again, these resistances intensify as you approach the site of the unconscious wish, as you approach the site of the unconscious wish, which has been repressed from the earliest years. Now, it might be interesting to note that one of the most popular philosophers, probably the most popular philosopher of the unconscious today, Slavoj Žižek, is someone who, in his own psychoanalysis and by his own admission, actively increased his resistances, actively sabotaged his own psychoanalysis on confrontation with the unconscious wish. So the degree to which we can fool ourselves, the degree to which we can lie to ourselves and obfuscate the truth runs extremely deep. So nonetheless, Freud thinks that what's crucial here in the free association devoid of hypnosis is the working through of repression and the discovery that what's going on basically is that there's an unconscious wish or unconscious wishes which are in sharp contrast to our normal ego's conscious wishes. And specifically, and this is interesting from a philosophical Platonic point of view, that these unconscious wishes are incompatible on the level of ethics and incompatible on the level of aesthetics. So we're dealing with the good, well, we're dealing with the true, we're dealing with the good, and we're dealing with the beautiful, and there's an incompatibility between the conscious and the unconscious. So he suggests that the end of the internal struggle between the unconscious and the conscious is the incompatible idea appearing naked before consciousness, meeting the unconscious wish force. And this incompatible idea, the subject discovers, was repressed due to the degree of unpleasure. So here connected to the ego being regulated by the pleasure principle, the degree of unpleasure which the unconscious idea would have caused the individual's personality and ego. So this is why, in some sense, in a psychoanalysis, you have to fight your own resistances. You have to fight with your own sort of normative, ethical, aesthetic standards. You have to, in some sense, fight against what you think your ego wants. And so in that sense, it's really why it's so important that a patient themselves submits to analysis and that someone isn't forced into an analysis. Nobody should be forced into an analysis. Only an individual who wants to be analyzed and wants to discover the unpleasure being caused by their unconscious, then an analysis can unfold. So now this is super important metaphor he gives, and I think it's one of the most important parts of the paper because it's so relevant to our contemporary times. He gives a metaphor of how repression is working. He gives the metaphor, and this is a metaphor of the mind, which is basically a metaphor of the society of mind. He gives the metaphor that the ego is the equivalent of a lecturer or normal speech in a room. Think about what I'm doing right now. My ego is giving a lecture to you. Now, the unconscious wish is the metaphor of a rude interruption. So if one of you in this audience started to rudely interrupt me, this would be the equivalent of sort of the unconscious wish coming to the surface and disrupting the normal appearances. Exactly. Mika, get the hell out. So So this rude interruption is, again, given the metaphor of the repression is basically having a security or having some sort of authority to expel the interrupter from the room. Now, the reason why this repression doesn't work, according to Freud, is that the interrupter, the interrupting force, continues to cause trouble outside, quote unquote. And by outside, we mean outside of the boundaries of the ego. That's the metaphor. So the idea here is that when the interrupter outside of the ego starts to cause more and more trouble to the point where you can't ignore the force barreling down on the normal appearances, you require a mediator to go and calm down the interrupter. And that is the function of a psychoanalyst. So the mediator and the interrupter are in a type of situation where they have to mediate an agreement to readmit the interrupter back into the room of the ego on better behavior. The reason why this is so interesting is because if you think about the North American academic context, specifically the North American academic context around woke culture, around SJW culture, around the phenomenon of someone like Jordan Peterson, these dynamics literally unfolded in many different contexts all across the continent. The Evergreen University, the Evergreen College situation was this. I even remember a Jordan Peterson lecture where there were SJW crowds that were literally banging on the windows outside of his lecture room. So again, this force of the unconscious here barreling down on the ego is something which needs a psychoanalytic mediation, basically. So Freud concludes here that repression fails, and you could even say here that Jordan Peterson in North America is a force of repression. I know, for example, Gabor Mate has said something like this, that Jordan Peterson is a force of repression. Now, the repression fails because the incompatible idea remains in the unconscious. It's going to continue searching for an outlet. It's going to continue searching for an opportunity to emerge and be activated. It's only waiting. Basically, if you repress negative emotions, that does not eliminate the negative emotions. The negative emotions are going to return. The negative emotions are going to be reactivated. They're merely waiting for the opportunity to emerge. They're really waiting for the opportunity to make themselves known, to make themselves heard. And that's why the importance of psychoanalysis is the talking cure, because these unconscious ideas need to be heard. They need space to be spoken and verbalized and made sense of. So on top of that, the unconscious idea does succeed in sending substitute and disguised wishes, which cause the same unpleasure that the repression tried to remove. The overall point here is that repression is not a solution. Repression leads to the same unpleasure that it's trying to get rid of, and ultimately is not a solution for building a more integrated adult personality, which is capable of speaking about and embodying the reality of the unconscious. So this is the final slide, and then we'll break into conversation. So the substitute for the repressed idea is the symptom of the neurotic and the hysteric. The neurotic and the hysteric and their symptom are only a distortion of the original repression, And you can trace from the symptom back through time to the original repression. And then you'll find the unconscious wish. Of course, in Freudian theory, the unconscious wish is related to sexuality, is related to the libidinal energy, attachments of early childhood, typically related to the mother and the father or early caregivers. Again, very interesting in the context of our contemporary academic and intellectual environment. And Freud's basically saying that when an analysis has been achieved, what is possible is not a total solution or a complete solution, but a better outcome than was offered by repression. So the possibility to end the neuroses, the possibility to gain conscious control of unconscious wishes, unconscious impulses, which may be difficult to accept. Again, thinking about the unconscious as incestuous, the unconscious as cannibalistic, the unconscious as murderous. All of these dimensions of the unconscious are extremely difficult for our egos to accept. But nonetheless, coming to terms with our darker sides, coming to terms with our incestuous, our murderous, and our cannibalistic urges is in some sense the pathway of psychoanalysis and the pathway of, I suppose, something like a psychoanalytic enlightenment. But I'll stop sharing now and let's chop it up. I mean, again, I think for me, it's interesting that these lectures are a very useful summary and a very useful overview of what has been achieved by psychoanalysis up to this point. And again, the context of being presented in North America, I think, has a lot of relevance today.
Yeah, I agree totally. It's a really good read. I think that a good case should be made about the fact that the case where a young woman was subjected to violent, like emotional shocks, the case, I mean, we're talking about Anna O here, who is the very bedrock of psychodynamic work itself. The first very like first case about where psychodynamic methods were applied in the first place. So the case itself, as Freud describes, it would fill every criteria of severe schizophrenia, and in today's standards would definitely be medicated to complete catatonic states with no prospects of any kind of recovery. But well, the history of Anna O or Bertha Pappenheim is really interesting, and I really recommend that you try and get to know about it. But basically, through Joseph Breuer's emphatic and patient intervention, she was able to transform from a really, really deep mess into an active social worker and lived a relatively good life after this state. So I think that this is a really like important point to be made about the very origins of like the whole psychodynamic movement that has been developed after this case.
I think that like one of the things I want to emphasize in what you just said was how the contemporary medical establishment would have treated someone like her, which is basically to overly medicate them, to put them into a catatonic state with no chance of recovery. In my work on the side, in my main work, I'm increasingly coming across people who are concerned at the degree to which their children and even themselves are being medicated into a catatonic state, simply because we do not know how to deal with emotional disturbances.
Yeah.
To me, this is the core, is how do we develop a culture which is capable, and again, including all of the paradoxes that Lacan brings up with the institutionalization of Freudian psychoanalysis and all of the ideological problems that emerged there. How do we as a culture confront the fact that we cannot, that we are incredibly emotional beings who are all in a type of spiritual metaphysical crisis on some level, and that the way to approach this problem cannot be through a systematic numbing of ourselves?
Yeah, isn't the kind of like the standard approach just to pretend that the splitting never occurs?
Yes.
There is a top of the pyramid who is up there saying that the split never occurs.
Yeah.
But we then again, we need the patches, the medication, and in effect, the splitting occurs at every step from the pyramid top down at the medical institution.
Absolutely, man. That's that's the most important information there for me, is, and I think that's why Freud becomes skeptical of hypnosis and calls it a mystical ally, because it's a way in which the split can be too easily obfuscated with a mystical unity, and also what led to Jung grounding mystical unity and desexualizing the libido, where you find the fundamental split, the split of sexuality itself. It's not the unity of sexuality. So I think everything is kind of there. And how do you work with that? And in order to work with that, you'd have to step outside of, or you would either have to be a different type of intellectual. Hopefully, this is in part what this whole workshop series is trying to build up towards, a different type of intellectual. Or you would have to dip your toes into the waters of very different types of intellect. Here I'm thinking about people in like people who are very comfortable with their sexuality in a non-repressed way. Could be the porn industry in some cases. Could be different fetish communities. I know that there's different people, like I'm just forgetting the name of the community right now, but they're basically communities of like cosplayers, and people who are basically very comfortable exploring and playing with the reality of libidinal space. I'm not sure if that's ultimately the solution, but it's part of it, perhaps. There's no ultimate solution, but just that the way in which, like, for example, I watched a movie last night, which I highly recommend, called Harold and Maude. I won't go into maybe some of you have seen the movie Harold and Maude, but it's worth bringing up because one of the commentaries in that movie is a critique, I would say a Lacanian critique of the Freudian institutions of psychoanalysis, because the psychoanalyst becomes the very ego which Freud is trying to critique, or trying to battle against in some sense, through identifying the resistances and repression. It's not a simple task, not a simple task.
Hello, I would like to say something. Do you hear me?
I think we lost Carol, no?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we lost him.
Yeah.
What I want to say is that
Hey, sorry guys, my internet. I'm not sure if any of you guys took over while I was gone or what happened.
I'm trying to say something. Hello.
Hi, Alexandra.
I would like to say that what I consider very precious is that Freud and Lacan and also phenomenology, they were able to keep some red threads throughout the history of philosophy and sciences and medicine. And this is very important because they were able, through their thinking, to create new paradigms which are different to the modern scientific positivist paradigm. And that's very important, I think. Because what is doing Freud, he's changing the paradigm of medicine. That's what he's doing. Because he's talking about a cause that is in the psyche, that is a psychological cause, a soul cause, not a material cause. Because in that text of the first case, we can see how the student of Charcot, Janet, he was very fixed in experimental medicine, in materialistic medicine, while Freud observed that the cause is has another origin. So it's the old question: who was the first, the egg or the chicken? Soul, body. So how do you see this this problem? Because that's what he is doing. He is keeping this red thread of psyche, of
Yes.
primacy of the soul, of the primacy of something which is not material,
I think,
objective.
yeah,
That's
I think
important.
absolutely. So what, like drawing here from both Alenka Zupancic and Lacan's work, I would say that the chicken or egg problem, or the soul and body problem, is basically dealing with the very split between the psyche and the body, dealing with the split itself. And that gives you what in Lacan's death drive would be an objective negativity. So it's not soul or body, psyche or body, but rather the very split, which emerges as unique in the human being between the two, and which is an ongoing contradiction, which is an ongoing, actually, it's like it's an ongoing spiritual process.
And I think from this point of view, our medicine, scientific medicine, is going through a big crisis.
Absolutely.
And psychoanalysis and phenomenology could help a lot. We are living an epoch of the sciences, I think. So what I'm trying to say is that also this idea that the unity of the ego is just a myth is also very important, because in his text, Freud shows us that the ego is just an imaginary unit, which is made up from a multiplicity of states. Double conscience. But not only double, multiple consciousness. Because that's what I liked so much. Before reading this text, I was imagining, because I'm using my imaginary, I was imagining this iceberg with a peak which is consciousness and down the unconscious. But after reading this text, I understood that it's very relative what is conscious and what is unconscious, because it's an alternation between these states.
Yeah, it's really an alteration between presence and absence, it seems to me.
Alternation.
Yeah, an alternation, yeah.
Yes, and also it is very interesting how one of the states takes the control.
Absolutely.
But sometimes people are able to play with different states without giving the power just to one of them. So
yes,
it's a little different than the first story with the iceberg, you know.
Yeah, I actually haven't come across the iceberg metaphor in Freud's texts. I haven't heard Freud use that metaphor. I haven't come across it anyway. I haven't come across the iceberg metaphor in Freud's his own words. I haven't come across. Again, the metaphor he's using explicitly in this text is the metaphor of you're in an institution giving a lecture and there's disturbances. So it's kind of like you have the normal appearances, you have the normative world, and you have the problem that there is no big other. You have the problem that there is no absolute authority. There is no absolute law. So there are disturbances which we have to become wise about. We have to be wiser about our own individual and social emotional disturbances within the individual, within the family, within the school, within all the institutions of life. The disturbances give you a clue to a crack in the normative order. And those cracks in the normative order cannot simply be repressed. They cannot simply be ignored. You can't just throw them out the door and wish they go away, because they'll return. And I see this metaphor, it's capable to extend this metaphor to many different areas of life in a very practical way. When I think about the family dynamics in my home, when I think about my own unconscious impulses, when I think about experiences I've had in doctoral school, you'll always have an individual or a part of the psyche that is trying to disrupt the normal run of things. And the truth of this disruption is where we need wisdom.
On that vein, if I might, I wanted to examine some of the Hegelian context that kind of serves as a background radiation for all of this. In his Phenomenology of Spirit, in the section on the freedom of self-consciousness, just after the master-slave dialectic, Hegel goes into talking about Stoicism and skepticism and the unhappy consciousness. And what's so interesting is, and I'm looking here at about paragraph 200 and following, he describes the position of Stoicism as a retreat, a withdrawal from Dasein, from determinate being. You know, it's a zurückziehen from Dasein. And this, I think, fits very well to exactly what Freud is talking about in terms of there is, within the mechanism of repression, there's this retreat from determinate being. But what's interesting here, the difference is that for Hegel, for the Stoic, the Stoic is retreating from the outer world. But for the neurotic, they're not just retreating from the outer world, but also secondarily from their own inner world of thought. Because what happens, what Hegel describes, is that when the Stoic retreats from the world into the inner world of thought, that determinate being follows it in and reproduces itself within thought. And so there has to be this secondary retreat from it, from that. And that's, we could think about that as a, the mechanism of repression. So what has to happen for Hegel is skepticism. The skeptic, which I think is a lot like the hysteric that attacks the master signifier. The skeptic does the negation that is needed, but the problem is that it only negates within the world of thought. It doesn't actually negate outwardly as it properly should. So I think that is a really good, I don't know, a background context for kind of understanding philosophically, I think what Freud is trying to get at, and I think maybe a good way to kind of think about the psychoanalytic treatment as getting, as accomplishing that determinate negation.
That's a really good comment. I was hoping that somebody could make the kind of Hegelian connection clear in this splitting of the consciousness. And yeah, I was thinking that in a way, I don't think that, I think that Freud is similarly to Hegel recognizing a kind of like unacknowledged territory within human experience in a way. And well, the kind of condition that he discusses as hysteria, he says that it's been known from Greek medicine also onwards, and it's the power of producing illusory pictures of a whole number of diseases. So basically the medical expert is at loss when confronted with the case of hysteria. I mean, somebody who's really coming up with hysterical symptoms, they really don't have anything organic or something tangible that is wrong with them, but they have something wrong. That there is something wrong in the determinate being of their condition, and they gain no sympathy from the doctor, but they have to somehow retreat from the world, but they cannot sustain the retreat, since the retreat itself starts to manifest quite painfully for them.
Yeah, so to kind of follow up with what Alexandra was saying is that, she was saying that it's not a material cause, but a psychological cause, but it's really both. It's really, there's an initial material cause.
Yes, that's why I emphasize the split.
Yeah, it's Anna O at at her father's sick bed. That's a material cause, but then as she withdraws from it, it follows her in to her inner world, and she has to withdraw then from that. And so what was material then becomes immaterial as a kind of reverse of the es war soll ich werden. It's kind of the opposite of that.
That's why I think I liked your reference to Stoicism as well, because I think that the truth of Stoicism, or like the transcending beyond the stage of Stoicism as Hegel describes in the dialectic, is a type of brave confront. Like, in order to really be alive, you have to also include death you have to accept death as a part of life, and sort of confront it and go into it, and in that sense you can sort of manifest perhaps a state of being which even transcends the stoical and the skeptical and the critical attitude, which I think is the type of being that is being pointed to in psychoanalysis, traversing the fantasy, where you have a type of, I don't know, even a more surrealistic approach to life, where like you're capable of embodying your fantasy in the material reality, despite the fact that everything's going to fall down around you anyway, if that makes sense. But like the fact that with the case of Anna O and her symptom at the site of the bed of her dying father following her into her psyche is like, you somehow, because this is relevant for me too, because I was just at sort of like the bed of my dying grandfather, and for me confronting that directly and being with that directly and sort of being as conscious I could be in that whole process and not running away from it, to me means that that problem is not going to follow me into my psyche in a withdrawn state kind of thing. It's kind of like going into it fully, accepting it fully, being, as it were, immediate in the real.
Yeah, and I think that goes with I don't remember if Freud makes this specific connection in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, or if it's someone else that I heard, but soldiers that are actually are injured in battle, they don't actually experience symptoms of PTSD, or because it's that actual experience of the real prevents the actual prevents them from having any psychological symptoms of that.
Beyond the pleasure
So,
principle.
yeah.
That's a really nice point.
I was just wondering something just on this discussion itself, on this problem of material and immaterial cause. I somehow, this question of saying that they are both together, or even bringing into focus this question of the split, doesn't really solve the problem. Because eventually, if you go and talk to a psychiatrist or psychologist who's working in the contemporary discourse, and you ask them that problem, for them, anything mental that we're talking about actually has corresponding physical effects. So if you talk about depression, they would have their own dopamine effects and all of those things corresponding to it. So in some senses, they have a certain certainty with this question of biology, which they don't get with psychoanalysis. And there's a problem at that level that we need to, I don't fully understand that question, which actually is the foundation of all biology today. All medical sciences have a certain foundation, which medical science, biology in that sense is not a strict science. It is a set of techniques. It is a set of technologies, techniques through which you are able to gain certain certainty upon a certain causation that exists in us, which with certainty doesn't exist on the other side in some sense, and which is where you get into this problem of institutionalization of psychoanalysis also. It comes from there, because you can't institutionalize it precisely because you cannot get that. And that struggle with doubt in some senses, that struggle against skepticism also, which I don't think we actually yet fully have a good grasp or an understanding of in what ways is biology actually working for us, even when we are actually trying to, in some senses, show its pitfalls and show its fallacies and so on and so forth. I don't personally, I myself fully understand this force of the biology, or this force of these techniques or procedures. Something like Bernard Stiegler's work goes in the direction of thinking through the problem of technology, techne, alongside this question of biology or life forms, or Scrodinger's book of What is Life. Would you have something to say on that? Some insight upon that problem in that sense? How do we think through this?
How do we think the psyche?
The opposite of psyche, in that by body in the context of biology. What certainty that biology, those techniques, or that technique is giving to us in the context of the unconscious. But unconscious cannot give you that same kind of certainty. That certainty will not ever come from the other side. That institutionalization will never come from the other side. And there is a perpetual imbalance over there. How do we think through that imbalance in that sense? There is something about that imbalance which wants us to put the cause on the other side. We want to say there's a cause in the soul and so on and so forth.
But we want to put the cause on the other side because we want to put the cause on the other side because we wouldn't have to deal with the messiness and the emotions of the psyche. So for let me give an example which is very close to my life, while I'll spare the exact names. But imagine, for example, someone suffering for depression because they've had a long-term struggle and battle with the idea of the father. And then you go to the doctor and they give you depression pills, right? And they would say, oh, you have dopamine imbalances, right? But they don't actually want to deal with the problem of not having a father. They don't want to deal with the problem of a good male role model that could help the subject to become an adult. That would involve emotional and psychological responsibilities, which are outside. They're basically pretending they don't exist and that they're irrelevant. So it's much easier to treat psychological problems as like fast food problems. Oh, I'll just give you a prescription and you can go to the doctor and get pills, so I don't have to actually deal with your actual psychological melancholia. Or I don't have to deal with the way in which the real is traumatic for everyone, for example.
Yes, and thank you that you raised that problem, because that was about what I was trying to talk. That's why it is so important that we have psychoanalysis and phenomenology, because the general narrative and the common sense medicine is the medicine of the third person, the objectifying medicine. And
Absolutely.
And we are minority, but it's a very precious minority. And
Yes.
The struggle of this minority to keep on going is very important. And
Absolutely.
And I also think that I have a big dilemma. Please help me. How can we shift through psychoanalysis from dualism to non-dualism? Because, for instance, that's so interesting, that story with the snake. So the patient has a hallucination, yes? She's seeing the snake and her fingers are transforming in some snakes. And through all these texts, Freud and Lacan, they are showing us how this unconscious drives are capable to modify and the outside world, because the patient, he believes, he is convinced there is a snake there. That's why it's hallucination. So, and from this point of view, I'm asking you, in which kind of thinking, what arguments can we bring for non-duality?
I think my personal answer would be that psychoanalysis is working with the non-duality of a split.
Okay.
So it's not the non-duality of a simple oneness. It's the non-duality of a contradictory split, which is the psyche itself, which is the location of the unconscious wish itself. Which means that
subject.
The split subject, yeah.
And this is also about this duality of inner world, outside world.
Yeah.
And about everything.
But one answer could possibly be just to increase negativity.
Yeah.
Could you explain this split of this non-dual split of the split? What?
Mika or Eric, you can take this if you want.
Well, in a Hegelian method here, a dialectical method, you know, we see, just as Hegel points out in many different points in the phenomenology, how one thing flows into the other and it flows back into itself, and you get this infinity. And I think we're seeing here how the material flows into the immaterial, and the immaterial flows back into the material in the form of a symptom, and you get this infinity, this cycle. And whenever you encounter something like that, in Hegelian terms, that has to be sublated. It has to be aufgehoben, you know, canceled, but preserved. Its negation preserved and brought to a higher level.
Yeah.
So, and I don't really know what that is going to look like, but I think that's the method, is that, okay, you know, we have to do this negation. That's what Mika was saying. There's this negation that has to happen. We have to negate both the we've negated the unified subject in the split, but we have to then negate the split in that traversal of the fantasy, the wo es war soll ich werden,
Right.
And that is a sublation into something that is new, something higher, at a higher plane of unity, that it isn't what it started out as. It still acknowledges the reality of the split, but forms some kind of new unity beyond it.
Eric, would you then agree that this question of the non-duality of the split is slightly different from the split that exists between the conscious and the unconscious? Because in the second case, the split exists within consciousness itself. It's not outside. It's not. That is why it's a non-dual question that comes out. Because the split is not between conscious and the unconscious, but in some sense, consciousness is split from the inside itself. When it's split from the inside, there is only then this question of non-duality that can emerge, which Alexander and Cadell were sort of thinking about. So when you talk about,
I think we're talking about
think about.
I think we're talking about kind of two different but simultaneous splits. There's a split from let's just say it's the symbolic, right? The symbolic order affects a kind of split from the real and the imaginary. It bifurcates that. But then the result of that is a further splitting of the consciousness into the ego and the unconscious. So it's the result of the symbolic order in using Lacanian terms that affects both, splits on both axes.
And that second split of the symbolic itself struggles with accepting negativity, because the secondary split always tries to create a law or an authority or some sort of symbolical big other, which would, as it were, eradicate the negativity and create some sort of figure of negativity, which is responsible for the split, which actually isn't, because they're also split.
Yeah, and that's the function of ideology in Zizek's terms. It's that which does not admit any contradiction.
Yeah, it's also wisdom. Like, what's the function of having like a teabag wisdom? It's just to enable the mind to stop the negativity from increasing in a way. But the way I see it is that unless this is going to be some kind of narcissistic game, then we need to just increase the type of like negativity of the resistance that we feel or we experience when we are going into the truth of the subject or the truth of the symptom and so on. So what Hegel is doing in philosophy, I think he's in a way succeeds in breaking the type of like narcissistic game which is going on in philosophy in every department. Even today, it's so tempting to go into this type of like internal loop which doesn't affect the crucial break, which is I think in like most like approachable terms, perhaps just increasing the type of negativity which comes from dealing with the truth of symptoms and the truth of where the systematic, like, well, say that there is a philosophical system which tells you that it's without any holes, but when you inquire into it, it's quite difficult. But you encounter some mistakes, some symptoms, and when you focus on the symptom, it brings up a type of resistance or negativity, which is the type of unacknowledged territory, which I think Freud also deals with. And yeah, it's not going to be some kind of like harmonic state of wisdom. It's just more negativity in a way.
I mean, like, think about like Socrates or any like deep figure in regards to their wisdom. is the negativity never goes away. Ultimately, Socrates has to confront his own death. So the wisdom is including within it this confrontation with an absolute negativity. So I think, again, that's it's absolutely against any type of, like what Mika's saying, this harmonic state of wisdom. Any harmonic state of wisdom which doesn't include within it the negativity is a false god. It's an image produced by the ego. Again, very common in institutional philosophy today.
It's so like it's so easy for the knowledge part of the mind, if we are able to speak of such thing, just stop thinking. Freud had this good quote that the kind of medical expert who is relying on knowledge, they cannot really understand hysteria, and in the face of it, they are always a layman, since it just levels them completely, since it's a territory which doesn't have a fixed knowledge. And the man of knowledge treats hysterical people as people who are transgressing the laws of his science, like heretics in the eyes of the Orthodox. He attributes to them every kind of wickedness, accuses them of exaggeration, of deliberate deceit, of malingering, and punishes them by withdrawing his interest from them. I mean, this is.
He treats.
I don't need to say much, but yeah.
I think.
Go ahead, Alexandra.
And I think this is a very important ethical problem.
Yes.
Because a real physician has to be able to say, I don't know, let the patient teach me. And that did Freud. He accepted that he is not an authority, and that there are things he does not know. And all these so-called hysteric women were able to teach him, because and that's a very important ethical attitude of accepting that I do not know. And as you mentioned, Socrates, he said, I know that I know nothing. So he was always able to stay in this no thing, in nothing, because nothingness is no thing in a way.
In this context, Alenka Zupancic also talks about contradiction as a limit of psychoanalysis. She claims that although the symptom disappears, the contradiction doesn't disappear. And also she writes that accepting the contradiction is not enough. She makes a distinction there. She says that accepting contradiction is a kind of a liberal perspective for psychoanalysis, and she more talks about engaging in the contradiction rather than accepting it, and she explains it as taking our place in it. So this is the distinction that Alenka Zupancic makes regarding the contradiction.
I love that part of What is Sex when she says taking our place in the contradiction and engaging with the contradiction. I think that's so important. And I think that the reason why most people don't do that is because it can be painful and you're constantly disrupting your identity. It's really becoming less tied to, like, you're constantly, you have an identity, but it's one that's constantly in contradiction. And that is almost like a stable, constant disruption. You're stable, but you're constantly in disruption.
Loss of identity is not necessarily a bad thing, you know.
No,
loss of identity is not a bad thing always, you know.
But for many institutional egos and for many, you know, for most people, it is. It's perceived as a negativity. It's perceived as painful and not liberating. But where, like, and I think, like, in response to, like, Eric and Mika bringing up Hegel, I think in Hegel, like, the places to look are where he identifies that the spirit reaches its highest liberation in the absolute dissolution, in death, in death itself, basically, as the absolute master. Which is very disturbing for most identities. Again, so we're talking about the birth of a different type of subject.
Isn't this what I found very interesting about the point of the physicians being laymen, is that they're kind of right. Like, these people, these hysterics are transgressing the symbolic order.
Yes.
They're not staying within the supposed egoic space. So that just means that they have a problem, right? Like, they can't go where the hysteric is going.
That's
But
right.
isn't this also what psychoanalysts do, and what these hysterics are doing is really a thing for the minority to engage in? Like, I don't see a mass psychoanalysis happen. I think that was a major problem as well with the Freudian institutions and ego psychology, for example, that it has to be betrayed.
I don't know. I obviously don't know the solution to this, but a point I wanted to make about this earlier was something that Zizek said about psychoanalysis being a quote unquote organized crowd. And I think the idea of an organized crowd is basically a way to think about psychoanalysis outside the institutions, and the idea that in some sense psychoanalysis is everywhere. Like, as soon as you understand the importance of free association, you can kind of bring psychoanalysis to almost any situation. It's kind of like the laboratory is everywhere. And I think I'd say, like, here kind of referencing Alenka Zupancic as well, that the unique thing about both Marxism and Freudianism is that the scientific laboratory or the experiment is everywhere. Like, it isn't in an isolated laboratory. It's in day-to-day life. Like, what we're doing right now is the experiment. You know, like, for example, Dimitri, like when we do the online men's circle, that is active innovation of a type of psychoanalytic, a type of communistic impulse, which we don't know where we're going with that, but it's nonetheless this ongoing engagement with contradiction, to like quote Everin as well.
Well, I think the Hegelian background of that, again, is back in the master-slave dialectic, where the truth of self-consciousness doesn't come to the slave until it realizes both work and fear of death.
Yes.
And so class consciousness in a Marxist sense doesn't really come about until there is enough pressure on the proletariat to cause that to happen. And so, to Dimitri's point about the minority, yes, that I think that's true, but that's not going to happen of its own unless the conditions are such that that's able to happen. From the point of view of just the precarity of life, the precarity of life, and then engaging in the labor of whatever it is that enables us to arise to that truth of self-consciousness in all, in a psychoanalytic sense.
Just on that point, I think it's worthwhile saying that there's a Dutch economist who introduced the idea of basic income, and he sort of goes to the idea that we should refer to the proletariat as the precariat class, instead of basically we're in an increasingly precarious situation, and especially as automation unfolds and as workers become increasingly irrelevant almost.
I would like to go on.
Excuse me, maybe I did not understand well what you said, but I have to disagree with you. Because I was part of this experiment, the so-called communism in my country, and it was awful. So
I'm not supporting the institutional communism or what happened in the 20th century.
I was a victim of it. And it has nothing to do with psychoanalysis. Even psychoanalysis was on the black list. It was forbidden. So I think psychoanalysis is for singularity.
I'm more more referring to the tradition of Marxist and Freudian theory. There is a lineage of academics who try to put a type of Marxo-Freudian theory together, basically arguing that one of the reasons why communism was such a failure in the 20th century was the absence of a proper understanding of the psyche.
Yes, yes, and I think that that it was a very, very, very abusive and a system that created a lot of victims. This communism. I just had I was part of it, so I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
absolutely. I'm not denying that.
Also, I would like to connect the point that Dimitri made, that well, isn't the problem basically the problem of trying to create a space for the type of very precious but unacknowledged mental states, but the type of community or the psychoanalytic community or the communist state that we are trying to envisage, it is trying to create a kind of like well, Christian community or holy community, which can enable people to be creative truly. So what does it take for people to be really creative? I mean, there has to be many institutionalized like structures available. I mean, nobody is creative on their own and so on, but there has to be like a community that can withstand the pressures and necessities and exigencies of life and so on. There has to be all kinds of things going on, mechanism, structure, so on. But what they are trying to do within, like, I mean, everybody obeys clock time, we have money, we have all kinds of institutions, but what happens within the type of hour or the session that they try to enable for people, it is something that's completely like, it's a hole or like void or emptiness in a way. I mean, it's beyond symbolic in a sense that it's trying to enable a space where there is a possibility for knowledge to be subsided or so on. So it's a struggle that's never going to be like completed or ended in the way that some kind of like wisdom would tell us. But it's something that's we need to be constantly like on the lookout for. But it's basically, I think that it's really boiling down to the problem of how to sustain a community which can, I mean, the psychoanalytic like community or the Christian community or communist community which can sustain. I mean, it was Marx's ideal that people could be more creative and they could like be freed from like stupid, laborious life that brutalizes. I mean, Marx was very, very attentive to people who were like in factories and like children who were working on salt mines or coal mines. So yeah, I'm not too proficient on it, but yeah.
It's a difficult question to think about, this question of community in that sense, because, you know, on the one hand, community is something which in some senses should bring together a certain set of people without actually in need of this external, you can call it authority, ideology, and so on and so forth. You know, but when you look at community in the modern nation state context, community actually emerges exactly from the point of that ideology or that question of what Foucault would call biopolitical power and so on and so forth. You know, the community itself is in some sense hounded from the inside, not so much in that, you know, so you are actually in a very, very different kind of a pharmacological fix in that sense, that what is supposed to work for you is exactly the same thing that is working against you. You know, the very same thing that is supposed to knit you together is actually the same thing is actually atomizing you in that sense. And that is what, you know, massification becomes in that, which is why when, you know, this question of Dimitri was asking, or we were discussing this question of material immaterial cause, at least to me, at least that question of materiality in that sense, of material cause or immaterial cause, mind, body, soul, or whatever, you know, is actually a question of technology. The question of techne first and foremost. It is a question where, you know, human beings can find certain certainty with their action. If I do this, then that happens. That famous paper of Derrida on writing, for example, where he was trying to sort of having that dialogue with Plato, where he was trying to think through this question of the pharmacological nature of writing itself, where on one hand, writing can be something which is externally, externally control you or externally subjugate you, or writing can something which can actually, in some senses, free you, or and the same problem actually exists when you think about this problem of desire and drive, this relationship between this extension of drive into desire, and then again it's shortening it, or it's complete immediate satisfaction that we can seek from a drive in that sense. Again, sort of falls back into that same question of techne in some senses, to which I don't personally have a good answer. But I think it's something we need to think about, that in what ways do we have to orient ourselves to our own drives to actually think about this question of community differently. Till that point, I don't think that question can be any seriously thought about. That minority will always remain a minority in some senses.
Yeah. And in a way, I think that the kind of Foucauldian point about power and knowledge, it's something, I think there is something about the very form of civilization that produces hysteria, and we need to have a place for it, and it's difficult.
I don't know if it's appropriate to bring up a point from a movie that I watched recently called Midsommar, where they had a type of community, a type of a type of communistic ethos in the community, but it seems like the way their community functioned was through a type of radical acceptance and a radical engagement with death, where they would have they would basically have a timed death, where at 72 you would be a part of a ceremony where you would kill yourself. But that seemed to ground a type of logic of development of identity and a type of embrace and a jumping into death, which our culture certainly views as an infringement on liberal individualism and an infringement on sort of the ideology of immortality, basically. But I don't know if that's worth bringing up, but I just thought it was definitely a movie that brought up a lot of interesting ideas in my mind.
Even there's a novel by Doris Lessing. I don't know if anybody has read through those her Canopus fiction series, Question of Canopus and Syrian. Anybody has read it? I'm not sure. I don't remember. The first one was Shikasta. The third part is Syrian Experiments. So there's this contrast between Canopus as people who sort of stand at the other of what she calls shamat or evil. So there's this relationship between good and evil that she's trying to construct, and she's put in this planet or this civilization called Syrians as in between this Canopus and the shamat in that sense. And what she's trying to struggle with is exactly the question that we're trying to struggle with in the book. That what would a civilization like Canopus, which is supposed to stand as the opposition to this decay that exists in all evolutionary cycles in that sense, should look like? I don't think she answers that question. But that problem is very interesting. That problem is extremely fascinating. That what should a civilization? I don't think we have an imagination for it. Also, a very clear imagination, as you very rightly said. This relationship to death. We might actualize it in these ways of saying that we should kill ourselves at this time, or we can actualize it in different kind of imaginary fantasies. But I don't think we have a concrete imagination of what should a community be like in that sense, which is not bound by the status structure in some senses. I think that imagination is somewhere getting lost to us for whatever reasons. I don't know what you guys think about it.
I think that
go ahead.
I think that all these wishes for togetherness and for sharing a community are imaginary stuff, and they risk to be just utopias and to have a bad end, as we could observe in history of humanity, because they are they are utopias. They have to do with the imaginary, not with the real. And when the real comes, then the whole dream transforms in some bad end. That's what I observed. I think it's very important to take in consideration the individual or the singularity of the individual, and that's what psychoanalysis is saying through the law, that there is somebody who is stronger and who makes the law, and the struggle and the fight is necessary between singularities in a way. Uniformity is very dangerous, and it's utopia. That's my opinion.
Absolutely, yeah. It's extremely important. I just wanted to say that the idea I was trying to explore with the reference to the movie was that the bad end of the utopian, the inevitable bad end of the utopian community was escaped in the idea of this movie, because you put as the utopian end your own death. So you accept the bad end, death is fully accepted, death is fully embraced, and then you get sort of the real, as opposed to the image of the community. This is only obviously represented in a movie, but I just thought that this was interesting to think about. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, but Chitan, when Chitan brought up the idea of what would, I think this is an interesting thing to think as well, what would a community look like which was not bound by status structures? Again, that's, I think, the idea that we have subjects who are implicitly building up the value of their identity through climbing a social hierarchy. And we don't really know what would sustain the individual in a deeper way beyond these kind of superficial, because obviously the whole status and the climbing the social hierarchy thing, that all falls apart into a bad end as well, because it's not the truth of the subject anyway. You know, it's a superficial way to relate anyway, like especially if like someone's dating you or someone is your friend simply because of some empty status structure, it's not the way to live anyway. That's not.
Can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, the thing with Midsommar is that although they seem to accept death, but just like what was mentioned earlier about engaging the negativity instead of simply accepting it, there seems to be a kind of obsessional neurosis to the point wherein people seems to automatically gets gravitated towards doing something, not necessarily to engage the negativity, but in an attempt to deny it, in an attempt to presume that the negativity does not exist, that there is something like an external guarantee of reality that would somehow be a kind of like an umbrella, I don't know, concept that would deny the negativity itself. So in Midsommar, I see it as a kind of these people appears to be deluded about having to accept death, but they're not really engaging the negativity. That makes some sense.
I think that's a good point. Yeah.
Another thing about Midsommar is, I don't know if anyone remembers, in the beginning, the first thing that happens to the protagonist is her entire family is killed. Her sister kills herself and her parents. And that's like the first thing that happens. And then she is about to be broken up with by her boyfriend and ends up instead invited on this trip, right? This, I don't know how you guys actually feel about Midsommar as a film, but it's not addressed later, right? There's lots of death in the film. There's the cycle where everyone understands that they're going to die at 70, and they're so prepared for it too. If you remember the guy who didn't die, he fell and he broke his legs, but he didn't actually die, and they're so prepared with these like hammers to beat the person to death who didn't die right away, right? But the initial trauma for the Florence Pugh character like is transformed entirely. Like the actual death of her parents and her family doesn't come back, and is instead, I don't know what word you would use for this, but it's sort of like it's transferred on to all of the people that she goes to this festival type thing with, right? Almost everyone dies, and almost by her hand by the end of it. But she hasn't confronted the actual death that started the whole thing, or the deaths, or, you know, all
so
the
it's
thing
like,
that she has to face. That is the reason she's the protagonist of this whole movie, presumably.
right. So is that connected to what now I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right either, but Art Chill, is that connected to what Art Chill's saying about they accept death, but they're not engaging the negativity directly, like they're kind of passing it around, like they're moving
That's the connection I'm trying to make. Yeah. They're it's an attempt not even to accept death, but to repress it, like to immediately cover it up with something else that allows you to continue. Because the whole point of that cycle, the Harga, I don't remember what it was called, was that you prioritize the rejuvenation of of that cycle, not your own beginning and end, but just that it continues anyway. You know what I mean?
That it's kind of like the mythical original community where the cycle isn't broken. It's like a perfect circle. Like it's a perfect circle without a gap, or a perfect circle without the negativity.
Right. And you sort of surrender your individuality
to
it.
Yeah. And that is yeah, it's a flaw in the utility of this movie being a model for, you know, some sort of whatever imaginary we're getting trapped in with the desire for communal connection or something like that. With that being said, I don't know if any of you guys have seen the other movie I brought up, which is Harold and Maude, because Maude's character is actually, I'm thinking now, much closer to a true revolutionary in relationship to death than the Midsommar community was, because she lived a radically idiosyncratic life. She's an old woman who lived a radically idiosyncratic life, full of life, and just sort of went into her own death, you know, just absolutely bravely, and like without bravery and courage aren't even words, because she just goes into it, and with no idea of any communal rejuvenation or anything like that. I don't know if we're drifting too far away from the topics of the papers, but we have 20 minutes left. So if there's anyone who wants to bring up something that's specifically related to the papers, that would be, now's the time.
Yeah, I would. I was just going to remark on one of the first things I noticed as I was reading through these, and I've been reading ahead in the third lecture as well, is I've been paying particular attention to how Freud uses his metapsychology. And you can really see how refined it is at this point, I think. And I think it's just really, I guess kind of refreshing to see him explain at a very elementary level the basic principles of psychoanalysis, and then to see how his metapsychology that he works out in the Entwurf and elsewhere is really coming through and being applied. And I guess I've been looking for one particular example, but the one that I did find that I wanted to bring out specifically is in the second lecture, page 24 of the standard edition. He's talking about the mechanisms of repression, and he talks about how the vehicle of this irreconcilable wish fell a victim to repression, was pushed out of consciousness with all of its attached memories and was forgotten. Thus, the incompatibility of the wish in question with the patient's ego was the motive for the repression. The subject's ethical and other standards were the repressing forces. And I see in that particularly is exactly Lacan's symbolic order, and how it, in the formation of the ego, is a defense mechanism against an over-cathextion, this excess of cathected psychical energy. And so you can just see very, very clearly this line from Freud's metapsychology through how he explains it here, and how it is picked up by Lacan in his own sort of metapsychology with the real, symbolic, and imaginary. So that's something that I've just been kind of, I've wanted to be attentive to as I'm reading through these lectures. For reference, I think if people have not read Richard Boothby's Freud is Philosopher, he has a really good section where he describes the Entwurf and how, at a very detailed level, how Freud had worked out his metapsychology and how that relates to the Lacanian notion of the symbolic order and such. So I just thought that was really clear and very refreshing to observe while I was reading these texts.
I would even say, in regards to this excessive psychological energy, like that I think a lot of Zizek's philosophy is kind of, endlessly repeating this, what about this excess, this excessive psychological energy, which we don't know what to do with, and no one know, it's worth thinking about a lot.
If nobody's asking, I wanted to ask Carol, you talked about the distinction between Freud and Jung, and you talked about this question of mystical ally over there. Can you explain it to me in that sense, that what is that mystical ally for Jung, which is not there for Freud in that sense, except that debate upon sexuality, which I understand. But apart from that, where do we trace that problem?
It's basically the the repression of repression, in some sense. Like, instead of going into the dynamics of repression, you bypass those dynamics and go straight to the unconscious via hypnosis. And that was the mechanism by which Joseph Breuer was able to make such quick work of his early patients. But Freud came to be skeptical of that mechanism, because he felt like if you didn't work through all of the mechanisms by which the ego repressed the unconscious wish, then the analysis would always be left kind of incomplete, and you would be kind of susceptible to illusory images of unity. And in that sense, you could say Jung, I guess from a Freudian perspective, Jung fell into illusory images of unity, with the idea of the collective unconscious, of masculine and feminine being a balanced harmony, all this type of stuff. And also sort of the desire to de-sexualize the libido as a way to avoid difficult problems of sexual difference and so forth.
Would you agree that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just to end by saying that the trap here is the over-identification with a harmonious one.
So would you agree that in some senses Jung could not understand the second negation in that sense. You know, the first negation, so there's a robbery of the bank, and in founding of the bank itself is the biggest robbery in that sense. The second negation that takes place, Jung could not make that second negation possible. Would you agree with that kind of thinking about it?
Really, the difference between Lacan and Jung to me is the affirmation of a mystical positivity versus the affirmation of a type of objective negativity.
But Carol, lot of sort of spiritual thinking. For example, if you read Sufi literature, which I do a lot, unity is a common theme in all religious literature in that sense. Would you sort of equate the unity of the religious literature from Gita to Quran to Sufism in that sense? Would you equate that unity to what the unity that Jung was trying to posit? Are those two unities same for you in that sense? Is it Lacan versus all literature that exists in the religious, or the Jung was doing something very specifically different over there?
I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert in all of the different spiritual traditions, because I'm not.
Mm-hmm. The only question is was Jung doing something particularly different over there, or was he in line with all other traditions? That's all that I was trying to think about. Yeah.
That the stereotype is that Jung was someone that was trying to salvage all of the mystical traditions for the modern world. That's like the stereotype. I don't know if anyone else has a more in-depth opinion on that, but please, if someone has more knowledge about this. I'm not an expert.
I think
go for it, Alexander.
When we are talking about mystics, Freud he said that mystics remains a secret for him. He was afraid, in a way, from mystics, the woman and the music. But because you are talking about Sufi, I know that there is that dance of the rotating dancers in some Sufi tradition.
Yep.
And these rotating dancers, it's in Sufi. And these dancers, when I was in Istanbul, I saw such a dance and I was fascinated. And I think they entered through this rotation of the body, they entered in that in a hypnotic state, in an altered state of consciousness, a mystic state. And I think this, maybe Evren knows more about that. But
they are roomies.
Yes,
whirling dervishes.
Yes. And what do you think? They enter in a hypnotic state, in a mystic state, which is hypnotic state, an altered state. And I think in all, for instance, in contemplation, in meditation, in praying, there are a lot in dancing, some ritual dance. There are a lot of rituals that can help you entering in some altered states of consciousness or hypnotic states or whatever you want to name them. And that has to do, and Jung, as I remember, he did this. He was telling to his assistants that now I will go and I will enter in some very deep states, and if it's dangerous, just take me out of them. So
Alexandra, my only question is that would you call all those states hypnotic states? Would you be going as far as saying that all those states are, in some sense, as Carol was telling us, bypassing the certain functions of ego?
I'm not a specialist.
Yeah, even I am not. I'm just asking.
But I think that all of us, we have the capacity. For instance, when you dream during night, you dream or you don't dream. You do not dream. So that's an illusion that we are unified. We just have a multiplicity of states, and this is just an illusion that we are one. We are unified.
Isn't this unification of the mystic? Isn't that essentially what Lacan would call psychosis? It's how he describes psychosis, as this kind of this loss of the sense of self, vanishing of the self, and this overbearing presence of the other. And I think for Lacan, he would look at the mystical experience as such and say, no, that's more akin to psychosis. But I think what Lacan, as he's coming from a Christian background and a Hegelian background, I think both he and of course Hegel would look at Christianity as being the very opposite of that, in such that the real heart of Christianity is the contradiction of the crucified God. And it's staying with that contradiction that defines the Christian mysticism, as opposed to other forms of mysticism that you might find. So I think Lacan, I think Freud is probably there as well. Is that they're trying to avoid that psychotic experience in favor of the neurotic.
I think it's not so important. It's not so important. Okay, it's important, the experience, but it's very important your attitude toward that experience.
Yeah.
If you are afraid of that experience, and if you want to kill yourself because you can't manage that experience, then it's a psychosis that needs treatment. But if you can experience it and you are so happy that you feel this, and in the same time you are able to go and to pay your bills and to behave as a normal person in the normal society, then you don't have a problem with that. If
Sure. I think we're just talking about structure, psychical structure here, rather than one subjective appropriation of it can be positive or negative. Sure.
But I think Jacques-Alain Miller, he came and he said that this classifications between the two structures, psychotic and neurotic, even Lacan, the late Lacan, is saying that it's not a very clear limit between them. So,
Evren, did you have something?
I mean,
you wanted to say?
also isn't it? I mean, this unity, pantheism, monism, the thing that brings Jung together with these mystic traditions, because these mystic traditions believe in unity, in pantheism, like harmonious one being one. I think this is what brings them together with Jung, and also, of course, the deeper meaning. And another different thing about these things is like their experiences outside the language, individual experience. This mystic experience is also individual experience outside the language. That's another difference between, let's say, Lacan, Freud on one side and Jung on the other side. But also, yes, I mean, this Rumi, I mean, also the Buddhism, other traditions, mystic traditions, they imagine a wholeness, I mean, pantheism, unity, which brings them together with Jung. This is the different as far as I
but as I see it,
yeah.
Jung is in some sense doing something, he's trying to bring himself alongside other mystical traditions. But as I see it, he's doing something different from the other traditions that we can debate about. I'm not an expert in those, but Jung is doing something clearly different at that level. He is, in some senses, as I said, negating the second negation itself. He's trying to find an identification with the unity, which is not, in some senses, how should you think about it in that sense? So when you take an example, like when you found a bank, and when you rob a bank, and then when you found a bank, the bigger robbery is of the founding of the bank itself. That negation that exists within the very first gesture of finding the bank, as Jack would talk about it. That thing that makes something totally contingent. When you discuss hypnosis and we discuss, say, other mystical states, and we think that all mystical states are hypnosis, we make that simple extension. I think what we are actually missing over there is that we need to rethink this question or this problem of unity, in the sense that we need to think through the problem of the second negation in that sense. Jung is unable to find a way of saying that the second negation itself has a how should I say it, has a particular place within the practice itself. For him, the unity actually happens or appears before you negate something the second time. Even when you negate something the first time, from the unity gets in some sense activated or achieved, or whatever you want to call it.
I would say that
I don't know how to think about it. I'm not very clear. I know, but
I would say that Lacan, where what you're talking about, Lacan situates himself on this level, I think, with the object patia.
Yeah.
Like the partial object is where the subject finds its kind of quasi unity, but it's in this negation of negation. But but even in the object patia, it's an object divided between love and hate.
Love and hate.
Well, isn't this the kind of like typical conflict also on their conceptions of the unconscious itself? Since well, there is on the one hand Lacan, and there is on the other hand Jung, who has all these kind of like daydreams about the figures and so on. But I think that it's basically boiling down to point that ever made, that it's trying to sort of grasp things outside of language. And the reason for why Freud is giving up the kind of like hypnotic method is that it's not that it's not inefficient. It might be really efficient, and it's trying to like trying to gain some kind of like hypnotic state or meditative state or whatever, so that there is no resistance in the psyche, right?
Yes,
I mean, they're
yes.
trying to like overcome the sort of resistance that comes inherent to language itself, and the way that they conceptualize the very desired state itself. So when Freud gives up the type of like viewpoint of the hypnotic method, there is not just a difference between the working methods, but difference between the desired state or the aim of the method itself. So the Freudian like Durcharbeiten, working through, it's opposed to hypnosis and refers to hard work of undermining resistance and patient's access to unconscious material. Well, hypnosis in a way leaves the defensive structure intact. It just circumvents the resistance, and the ego is sort of put to sleep so that repressed memories can freely emerge, and the subject can engage in this like so-called non-linguistic like free fantasizing and gain nirvana or whatever. But the basic point is that the unconscious content is, for us humans, is not something covered up by resistance, but it does not simply it doesn't pre-exist resistance. It is something that's immanent to resistance.
Yes.
Something that can be uncovered by the immanent analysis of resistance. And I'm here referring to Zizek's absolute recall.
Yeah. And that I think that point is also echoed in Alenka Zupancic, What is Sex?, where this something immanent to resistance brings us to the level of repetition, and the repetition, I think, of the object patia. And I think that level of repetition is kind of also the level that correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the level you're trying to discuss, Chitan.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's this is the frontier of this. What we're talking about is the very frontier of contemporary philosophy of psychoanalysis, I think. Lots of problems here, but lots of brilliant minds here, so great conversation. And like my big, like the question I'd have that I'd want to like sort of throw out there is basically Freud, even if let's all sort of play the game that we agree with Freud's move on getting rid of hypnosis. But then the problem that emerges for me with Freud's method is how inefficient it is, and how impractical it is to imagine a situation where everyone has the time, the space, the resources to undergo the type of psychoanalysis he's suggesting. So like I can't think my way out of that. You know, I can't think, I just don't see it as possible to universalize what he's proposing as a method.
Actually, Cattle, this is actually a question of time, not other things. Resources of everything is secondary. It is first and foremost a question of time.
We don't
That
have
is
enough
how-
time for that.
Yeah, that's the whole point.
We
And
don't
it's not
have
just
enough
time
time.
for, there is something about time itself in psychoanalysis that has to be understood over there. Because
Yes.
time itself poses its own break within the course of the treatment in that sense, which is why technology and technique come into picture. Writing becomes such a convenient form of, thinking in that sense.
I agree.
And that's something we don't understand fully well. What is our relationship to time in that in the course of treatment and so on and so forth?
Well, I think Lacan's punctuated session is trying to address that to a
Yeah.
degree. In other words, to try to end the session in such a way that the patient is still doing a kind of auto-analysis after the session is over. You know, so they're not tied to the session itself.
And I think it's a problem of assuming responsibility in a way and giving a meaning through filling that gap with some discourse. While in hypnosis, you are in a way passive as clients.
Yeah.
In psychoanalysis, you work by free association, by finding some meaning to fill the gap. Even in my opinion, it's artificial filling of the gap. It's just illusion that you fill that gap. The gap is still there, I think.
The gap is still there. It's just no longer filled with memories of the past, which are haunting you unconsciously. But then you have the ethical problem of dealing with the gap itself in its emptiness.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Which brings us to the problem of women, Alexandra.
Yeah. And, okay, if that's the problem, and that's my last question. I visited a wonderful exhibition in Paris about psychoanalysis and Freud, and I saw all these pictures with a lot of very scientific men, but only men, 10, 20 men, doctors, whatever, and one patient, a woman, was observed in a very rigid and distant way. The woman was hysterical, and all these men were very, very interested in that symptom. I would like to ask you, because the majority here are men, what do you feel in front of a hysteric woman? You like it, you dislike it?
I think I've had I think I have my own relationship to my own hysteria at this point.
Okay, it was a very diplomat answer.
You're asking the relationship between hysteria and power, basically. In what ways does hysteria actually develops a certain kind of an equation with power in that sense, that power always wants to co-opt hysteria in some senses.
Yeah.
Because why does it happen? What happens? I don't know. But there is a particular way to think about that question. I'm not sure I understand that very well personally myself.
And about sublimation, because in the second text, it's about sublimation.
I think that a man, in a way, always fails to be a man also.
Absolutely.
I would just like to say that it's this coming to terms with the knowledge of unknowing, like of accepting the gap internal to knowledge itself, like kind of like what we're pointing towards with the knowledge of Socrates. It's like that, I think, is the lesson of hysteria.
Well, the common wisdom would today align with what Alenka Supansis calls the metaphysics of finitude, that I mean, we are all finite beings and we are all like just humans. But in a way, we should reconcile with the fact that we, even humans are not really humans, and we even fail to be men and so on.
Well, I think in her metaphysics of finitude, it's that we're finite humans that fail to be finite. Like we're not good at being finite. Like animals are good at being finite. Humans are finite, but we're not good at it.
We are not really like infinite. Well, the common wisdom goes against the way that somebody would go towards the excess of claiming towards infinite truth. But so we are not really infinite, but we even fail to be finite.
Yeah.
So that's the physics of infinite that she's like articulating.
In some of the tantric traditions I've been reading about, and also like studying like sort of like the actual embodied being of mystics who have spent their entire life in practice, is like kind of like the difficulty. It seems like the pinnacle of their activity is like being a graceful nothingness. Like they're just sitting there in the sun. Like they're capable of doing nothing. Like they're capable of just being nothing, and it's incredibly difficult to do. I mean, I can sit in the sun for a few hours now, but it's hard to sit and do nothing.
The kind of like question that I have like been thinking about when encountering the kind of like yogis and tantris. I mean, would they really be unfazed in the face of like Anna O, like really hysterical woman?
I think Osho was.
I'm not that sure. Yeah.
What's the question again, Mika? Can you just repeat the question, please?
Well, if there was a like really hysterical patient, let's say, would they really be capable of sustaining their peace of mind? I mean, they always like cling to knowledge.
Well, I think this has been one of the most enjoyable workshops so far because of just how much variety. I love the wild garden of intelligent people here right now. It's really nice. Yeah, so like a lot of you guys are here new for the first time. I definitely encourage you, if you enjoy this and you want to continue on this path. I'm going to be continuing doing these Return to Freud's until we've worked through all of his literature. So I'd encourage you to come back if you're into this type of thing. Just for the viewers on YouTube, I guess I'd give like just a brief summary of what we've covered here. Is the first 2 lectures of Freud's 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. In the next workshop, we'll cover 3, 4, and 5. And I think that the utility and like the importance of this paper is really getting a context on where psychoanalysis was at this point in its development, the way in which it was introduced to the North American context, which again, I think, as I tried to stress in the presentation, has enormous relevance to contemporary North American academia. I even think it's amazing that the metaphor Freud gives for the unconscious has, direct empirical manifestations in contemporary academic North American life. Yeah, so I think it's still a model with utility. It's still a model worth thinking about, and it's still a model that's been repressed by medical institutions, by those involved in therapeutic industries. And it's still a mystery, as I think kind of how we ended this whole discussion about the place of hysteria, specifically the place of hysteria vis-a-vis knowledge, and how to think gap, how to think absence, how to think the impossibility of knowledge. So thank you guys all for being with me today. I appreciate all of your contributions, and look forward to the next workshop.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks.